Hello, everyone. So this is our fireside with Dr. Joe Mozer, previously the Space Force Chief Science Officer. Very happy you can join us and very much looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Sir, so just if I could have you introduce yourself, you're probably well known by many, but some might not know much about you yet. Could I get get you to describe your career for maybe 30 seconds to a minute or so?
Sure, and I don't know how well known I am, but as you said, I just finished a stint as the Chief Science Officer, the very first Chief Science Officer of the United States Space Force. I've done that since the stand up of the Space Force back in December of 2019. Before that, I was the Chief Scientist of Air Force Space Command, so did essentially the same job for the Air Force Major Command before the Space Force stood up. And before that, I spent most of my career at an Air Force research lab doing research and space experiments as part of my daily job. I've had a great career in all aspects of space, and even before that, terrestrial research that I was doing. So I have the pleasure of being able to retire just at the beginning of this year. So I'm 2 weeks into retirement, trying to figure out what to do with myself. But glad to be able to chat with you here today.
Outstanding. And I really appreciate you joining us. That really leads very nicely into the first thing I wanted to bring up, which is as you've retired, obviously you've had a couple of weeks at this point to kind of think about your time in the Space Force. I wanted to get your thoughts on the vector of the service, and especially as it relates to science and technology, which was really your wheelhouse.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. Bottom line up front, I think the vector is pretty good. We're off to a good start. We're 4 years into it. From a science and technology perspective, there were a couple of really positive decisions made by the first Chief of Space Operations, General J. Raymond, when the Space Force was being stood up and the fundamental essence of the space staff was being determined. And one of those decisions that he made was that he wanted a presence of science and technology on the space staff. So um, somebody that's on his staff to give him advice, but more so look out after how to convert his commander's intent and top level strategy into science and technology projects and priorities. And that's significant because it was outside of the acquisition system. A lot of times people think about science and technology being part of acquisitions. It's more we're fielding new material solutions, for example, in S&T, and that is true. But the fact that the chief of space operations had an office, the Office of Science, Technology, and Research, which I led, um, um, it speaks volumes in the importance that the Space Force put on science and technology. General Raymond would go around saying we're going to be the most technologically advanced service the world has ever known, which is true. If you think about it, we can't operate one iota in space without some of the deepest technology that we have. So science and technology is very important to that. So that put the Space Force on, in my opinion, on a very good vector when it comes to science and technology. Um, it also shows that there's a long-term commitment. The Space Force is started out very small. It's still very small compared to the other services. We're just a few thousand individuals, where the Air Force and the Army are hundreds of thousands or million folks. So we're small. But we have to cover down on a lot of different things, and science and technology is one of them. And the fact that we have the offices that I led and worked in tells me that we have a commitment to the long term. Our force development process can take many years, going from a basic idea or a new phenomenon discovered in the laboratory to something that's fieldable and usable on an operations floor can take 20, sometimes 30 years before it reaches fruition. So you have to you have to anticipate and think in advance of where you need to invest your precious science dollars, so that when the time comes, you're ready for those operational capabilities. And Depending on the unexpected things that might happen between now and then, you have options to go in different directions. So that's another good vector that Space Force got off and on. And the third one I guess I'd highlight is related to the laboratories. So the Air Force Research Laboratory, which was principally the in-house government laboratory for the Air Force, now supports the Department of the Air Force, so both the Air Force and the Space Force. And Major General Heather Pringle, early on in the stand-up of the Space Force, came up with a mantra: one lab, two services. So it was really recognizing that there was a duality of the mandate and the leadership and strategies that were going to drive what AFRL does. And that was a big challenge for the labs to be able to figure out how to work that out and make sure that both the needs of the United States Air Force and the United States Space Force were taken care of. So that's a very good thing. I think there's still some challenges there because of things like the other services, the Navy, the Army, the Coast Guard even have capabilities that are relevant to the Space Force that we need to take advantage of. And we have burgeoning partnerships with those other service labs, but we need to continue to develop them in the same way that we have with Air Force Research Lab. And similarly for other interagency collaborations and partnerships, such as with NASA and NOAA and Department of Commerce. So I think we're on a good start. There's a long ways to go. I think we have some challenges ahead of us. The future will tell how well the first 4 years provided a baseline for us to springboard from, but I think we're on a good start.
Yeah, just two things to highlight about what you said. One of them being that we're a small service, we're getting bigger, but we're still very small. If I remember correctly, I looked at the budget numbers for the Space Force. By budget, I believe the Space Force is about 16th largest military in the world. If it was just the Space Force was the sole service, so it's a very small service trying to executing a lot of dollars because the size of the mission is huge. But as you said, there's not a lot of people.
That's right, and that's also a testament to just how technologically advanced and hard space is. So one of the reasons we have such a large budget is because we have to invest in hundreds of million, if not billion-dollar satellite systems and constellations that achieve our mission. So it's a very expensive domain to operate in, and it's reflected in our budget.
Yeah. And then the other one that I wanted to highlight is you mentioned it was 20, 30-year cycle between when we were doing the basic research, applied research, prototyping, and then finally a system of record, and it gets out on the operational floor. I mean, to put that in perspective, like we're on this year, 2024, we're on the iPhone 15. So the iPhone wasn't out 20 years ago. And I mean, that's a ubiquitous everywhere today. And that 30 years ago, you're talking about the beginning of the PC era. To put that in perspective, that you would be, if, in other words, if this was a space program, it'd taken that long, you'd be just starting to put some PCs on satellites for comparison.
That's right, and that's actually very significant that you bring that up, Josh, because we are in a point in history where we're seeing technology grow at a faster rate than we've ever seen it before. And that's pointed out in places like our national defense strategy. It's also a time when technology spreads faster than it's ever spread globally, whether we want it to or not. It's very hard to stay on that leading edge and keep in front of the technology when things are happening that fast and spreading that quickly. And that really gets back to the point I was trying to make is the military in general, but Space Force just as much as any other service, have processes that we develop new capabilities for new force development capabilities, and it's a good process. It's stood us well for many years. Where, for example, when a new concept is developed, or somebody has a new idea to do something, use GPS for navigation, it would be a concept. Then we develop that concept. We think about all tangential concepts that might feed into it. We war game it. We develop doctrine and tactics and procedures. And then when we've done a lot of that kind of thought, we will then start defining requirements and acquiring the system and then fielding it and operating them and applying the full .mil PF entities to that capability. And that's the part that takes the 20 to 30 years to go through that sometimes. Now that we're in this era where technology is growing so quickly and spreading so quick, fast around the globe, we really need to figure out not how to short circuit that force development process, but to figure out how to make it more agile. So as new technologies are developed, we have to be able to insert them midway through that whole chain of things and insert the new technology or respond to a new threat, technology that's a threat to us. And so that's part of the challenge that we as a nation need to face is how we become more agile in our institutions and our systems when it comes to science and technology.
Yeah, I would agree. I think speed and agility are absolutely essential. And as the chief science officer of the Space Force, you also were leading a lot of what's referred to as strategic foresight efforts. Um, would you mind talking about how the Space Force has applied strategic foresight, especially as it relates to the future of the space domain and how that influences what we invest in today for the fight in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk about that. And it relates to what we were just talking about, because when you're trying to develop agility in applying technology or responding to technology, one way to do that is to anticipate conditions in the future, not necessarily predict the future. And I'll get back to that point in a second, but anticipate things that could happen in the future and be ready for them. So being ready means investing today in technologies that will provide us options in the future. So when the time comes, something unexpected happens, we at least can go to the shelf and look at some of the fruits of that early investment. So that was the whole point of the strategic foresight that we developed under the Space Force and continue to carry on. The tagline I like to use is prognostic future operating environments is something that a lot of folks in the military strategists do. We try to predict what the most likely or the most dangerous future operating environment might be. And then we build our force to meet that challenge. And that's absolutely important. Have to do that. That's critical to making sure we're secure. Strategic foresight, on the other hand, is all about preparing for the unexpected, the things that we don't anticipate, we don't think is most likely or we can't see coming. And so that was the whole idea of the strategic foresight's efforts that we started all the way back in 2018 before the stand up of the Space Force. And we've had about a dozen space futures workshops with lots of subject matter experts who have participated from government, intelligence community, academia, private industry, other places to come give us their thoughts about what's possible in the future. And so in 2019, we published a report. It's called The Future of Space 2060. So we were looking 40 years out, just trying to define a set of scenarios that cover the waterfront of how things could possibly evolve. And we looked at three different things. We looked at the space economy, how big that was going to grow or not, the number of humans that live and work in space. Today it's a small handful. Some people talk about in 40 years it might be tens of thousands. And then leadership in space. Is it really going to be led by Western liberal world values, open sort of approach to leadership in space, or is it going to be more authoritarian? So we published that report 2016, and that again was defined to try to just map out some scenarios, and we came up with 8 different scenarios that were different corners of that parameter space defined by humans in space, money in space, and leadership in space. And the idea was to have some tabletop exercises and some strategy sessions where we tried to think through some dilemmas that the United States Space Force might be called upon to resolve in each of those scenarios and develop some strategy around that. We did that. And one of the interesting things that I like to point out these days, so that was 5 years ago that we published that report, and lots of things have happened since then. Lots of unexpected things have happened since then. So just to put a finer point on it, is hard to predict the future. And trying to understand exactly what the future is going to be like is impossible. You can only come close. So just think about, since 2019, what has happened on the world stage. And I like the construct of STEEP: social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. Just 5 different things to look at. In the social world, we had a pandemic. We lost 7 million lives worldwide. One thing about that is 8 out of 10 of those people that died from COVID-19 were above age 65. So in a sense, we sort of lost a generation. Those were our fathers, our teachers, our sage mentors. We just lost a generation. Kind of associated with that, we had the Great Resignation, where 36 million Americans quit their jobs. In the realm of technology, lots of stuff's happened in those 5 years. The size of the internet has tripled. It was in 2019 about 41 zettabytes. Today it's about 120 zettabytes. So that continues to grow. We've seen just over the last year or so the rise of generative AI and large language models, ChatGPT. Just think about the conversations that have happened around that technology over the last year. About a year ago, we saw the first net positive fusion reaction. Quantum computers back in 2019 were 10 or 20 qubits at most. Late last year, IBM announced their system with over 1,000 qubits, so 2 orders of magnitude increase. So lots of technology changes. In the environment, global warming has marched on. We've seen global change, lots of different effects, including the increase in global average temperature by about a degree. We saw fires in the West caused about $20 billion worth of damage in 2019 alone, or 2020 alone. In space, we've seen orbital debris grow 10 times, especially between 500 and 600 kilometers altitude. The amount of stuff up there is just growing crazy. And economics, the size of the space economy is almost doubled. We've seen the space industry grow to about $450 billion a year. It used to be about $250 billion a year. And of course, in political realms, we've had things like Ukraine and Israel. So just in that 5-year period where we were trying to predict 40 years out, there's all these things that happened that we didn't anticipate. And the whole idea behind strategic foresight is not necessarily to anticipate the specifics, but to at least understand what the range of possibilities are, so that we can invest again in the basic and applied research that will help us have options for there. And you asked what's come of that. One of the things that's come out of that strategic foresight is that the Space Force, with the help of Congress, has decided to invest a lot in academic institutions, in setting up American universities. We still have the best universities in the world, and let's put them to use for solving specific problems for the Space Force. So we've stood up strategic space technology institutes, for which you are the program manager of. So you can speak very much in detail on that. But essentially, those are virtual institutes of multiple universities coupled with industry around key technology areas, things like cislunar operations, or power and propulsion or advanced remote sensing, cyber data trust in space. We're standing up those things, engaging the best minds in academia to help us with that, because we know that the future is going to be uncertain, and those are the areas that we've seen that we need a strategy for. So that's my pitch for strategic foresight in a nutshell.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, that was a very thorough answer. Thank you. I mean, we've talked about the what the Space Force is doing, all of the good things we're doing. I wanna invite you to make a little bit of a more pessimistic turn here as we look at what if the USSF fails to protect the nation's interest now and in the future. What sort of stuff would that look like?
Yeah, that's a very important point and good question, Josh. That the Space Force and the space national security space in general has a very difficult challenge ahead of them, um, along two things. So the first is, and there's a lot of in the community, a lot of debate about what's the real role of the Space Force and Space Command. Um, is it to support the joint terrestrial warfighter, or is it to more generally protect us in space in case war extends into space? So that what we've come up with through our strategic foresight work is something that we call the dual mandate. And that really refers to the two different fundamental jobs that the Space Force needs to organize and train and equip for. One of those is to provide the communications, the PNT, the surveillance, and all the other pieces to the joint terrestrial fight. So as soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines execute their missions, they are dependent on services from space, and the Space Force absolutely has to take that seriously and provide those services. That's one mandate. The other mandate is protecting the nation's interest in space, which could involve things like protecting commercial satellites or constellations from attack, or even as we expand out to cislunar and beyond out to Mars, providing the infrastructure and the capabilities to ensure the security of the nation's interest in that domain. So it's sort of the looking up part of the mandate. So the challenge is that we got to be able to do both of those things on a limited budget with limited manpower, and do them well. So the challenge is to do that in a balanced way. So I think one thing that could go wrong there is if we spend too much time debating which one of those two things we need to do more of, whether we need to be a quote blue water space force or a brown water space force. If we divide ourselves too much on that's going to limit our ability to do either one of those missions. The truth of the matter is we have to be able to respond to whatever the need is. So if we're going to protect our nation's interest in space, we need to be prepared to go and do whatever it is that's needed to be done to do that protection. And that's where staying on top of the technology, staying in front of the technology, is critically important. And even bigger than that, really, is we can't get too focused on either the war fighting or the security aspects of space in isolation. Truth of the matter is, we are in a strategic competition for technological superiority in space, with strategic competitors, China and Russia. China in particular, the PRC has stated goals to become the premier technologically dominant nation in cislunar space. They are pushing very hard, just as they have in other areas of technology, everything from 5G to biotechnology and artificial intelligence. They're investing in a big way in becoming technologically dominant. I think we need to understand that if we fail to invest in a large way and to stay in front of that curve, we will come in second place as a nation, not just as a Space Force or a DoD. As a nation, we will find ourselves behind the curve, and I don't think that's something that the American public will enjoy much at all.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I would point to the relationships that China enjoys or does not enjoy with its local neighbors, and I would argue that it is definitely a negative world to live in, one dominated by a Chinese and Russian system. So looking for that, yeah, definitely a very pessimistic consideration, but one that has to be looked at realistically. Um, in order to avoid that. And if you were not even like CSO or president, even because both of those positions have limitations, if you were emperor for a day, what sort of things would you institute? What sort of things would you change if you had a completely free hand?
Yeah, well, just to wish it were, right? So, but if I had my way, one thing that would be very important is just what I said is, I think that the American public needs to realize that our technological dominance is being challenged. We've been surpassed in certain areas, and that space is an area because it's sort of the next frontier. It's an area that's expanding quickly. We're seeing new use cases for space, new revenue streams forming in case space. We're advancing the technology to use it better. It's a primary place where technological advancement will happen over the next decade or so. And the first thing I would do is, if I were king, is to get everybody to realize that we're either going to be competitors in this race or not. And it's very important, going back to concepts like, what is the United States fundamental grand strategy? What is it that we hold most dear? Um, our ability to do things and have technology that allows us to see what other people are trying to do to us and going other places. So that would be the first thing. How do you respond to that though? It's clear that the PRC has very definite investment strategies to become technologically dominant. Their 5-year plans call out specific technology areas where they want to invest in. Space is one of those, and they follow through. They have, if you look at their fraction of research and development that they're putting in of their gross domestic product, they are very, very rapidly catching up to what the U.S. invests in basic and applied research. So we need to up our game in that area too. We need to figure out what are the key areas that we need to invest in, that we need to stay technologically dominant in, and invest in those areas in a big way. It's kind of like the moonshot in the 1950s and 60s, where we were developing technology because we wanted to demonstrate to the world that we would be technologically advanced in being able to put the first man on the moon. We need to do those things again, and we need to make sure that the world knows that we're serious about that. So it's easy to say double the amount of money or triple the amount of money you spend in science and technology, but there's some other things that could be done too. Things like integrating across the civilian space institutions, NASA, the military institutions, the Department of Defense, and some of the commercial institutions such as NOAA and the Department of Commerce. There's great work happening in all three of those things, doing important jobs. There's something to be said for putting those spacefaring organizations together more holistically than they are today. So if I were king for today, that's one thing I would look at. Maybe a United States Space Service that encompassed all three of those things. Not that they're not doing great things together, but we need better synergies amongst the interagencies, and the precious federal dollars that we're investing need to go further. So if we could communicate and strategize together better, that would be good. And then finding ways to have public-private partnerships. So A lot of the advancements that are happening in space are not government funded. They're happening from industry and entrepreneurs who are finding new ways of doing things. That is absolutely fantastic. We need to encourage that. However, we can't completely cede all of our national security space to commercial entities to develop, because clearly there's a different motivation that an entrepreneur has than a national security agent would have. Um, but we need to find ways to partner across those two things. So we need to figure out how do we incentivize from a government perspective industry to develop in positive ways for U.S. superiority. And that can be through seeding basic research, technology investment, putting investments in universities, as we talked about earlier. Maybe it's policy, maybe it's more legal realms that we need to make some changes. But we need, if I were king for a day, I would I would want to develop a great strategy so that the private commercial entities and the government national security entities and exploration through civil space would find a common set of goals that we could again have sort of a moonshot type North Star vision in space that would drive the technology. Don't know if that helps, kind of big picture, but that's where I would go if I were king for.
Well, thank you. And as we're getting ready to close, I want to ask you a question. I'll talk for about 30 seconds here to give you a chance to really consider your answer, and then we'll come back. So the question I want to ask you as we close, for the audience across industry and government, if you could communicate one thing to them about what they can be doing at a personal, business, governmental level as individuals, what to them to help with this, what would you communicate? As you consider that, I do want to say you mentioned that there's a second space race, or that there's a space race going on, very similar to the moonshot in the 50s and 60s. And I've often heard it referred to as the second space race. That the first one was for national pride and a demonstration of technology. The second one is ultimately a competition. There is also ultimately a technological competition, because you can't do it without that in space. But it's ultimately one of economics and national power, being able to be the cornerstone of the future space economy that radiates out from Earth first into cislunar, and then you mentioned Mars and even beyond. And so it is. I don't think it's too strong to say that it is in many ways an existential conflict that we are in fact in. And so with that context, if not to put too much pressure, but
Yeah.
if you could communicate one thing, what would that be?
Yeah, no, excellent question, and I agree. It's an existential conflict that we're in, whether we realize it or not. It's a challenge that's going to make or break us as a nation, along with many other similar challenges that are being put out in front of us. And if there's one thing that I would emphasize with down at the individual level, individual companies, individuals, government organizations, it would be to emphasize the need for highly technical workforce. So we need to, all the usual things, promoting STEM education, increasing diversity, getting more folks to go into these not only high tech fields, and it doesn't have to be space. It could be biotechnology or cyber, lots of different areas. But we need a broad base of workforce, because everything else sprouts from that. Everything else comes from having the trained capability. And just this morning, I was reading a report that was co-written from the NASA, Department of Defense, and Department of Commerce for the National Space Council meeting that happened in December. That really was pushing the idea of getting a better, stronger workforce prepared for advanced manufacturing jobs in the future, and that includes space. So, everything from additive manufacturing, advanced materials, hypersonics, thermal protection systems, digital manufacturing. we need to grow those areas quickly because we're facing threats across the board in all of those areas. So encouraging your niece or nephew or son or grandson, granddaughter to go into a technical field that could support this future technological advancement for the nation is should be a high priority for lots of folks. We need those people in the future.
Well, thank you for that. And as we close, once again, thank you, Dr. Mozer, for your time. I really appreciate getting to have you on and getting to have this fireside chat. Certainly, thank you for your time, and hopefully we can do more stuff like this in the future.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it.